of blunt injuries, particularly bruises. It's very difficult sometimes to tell just from the appearance of the bruise whether it's new or old. Um, I think all of us have had the experience of having a bruise that turns, initially maybe blue or
Judge,
purple.
I'm going to object at this point. It's become a bit of a narrative, and I've been patient, but
Sustained.
Dr. Christensen, when you talk about bruising, can you explain a little bit about what we see with bruises? I think you were talking about different colorations that we might see with those.
Yes. The colors basically don't necessarily tell you anything about the age of the bruise until you start seeing colors like yellow and green and brown that are the result of hemoglobin pigment degradation. But to see a bruise, whether it's red or blue or purple, you can't really tell when any of those are of a specific age or not. They might be recent, they might be older.
In conducting the autopsy on Tammy Daybell, did you and Dr. Marsden in fact reach a conclusion as to the cause and manner of death?
Yes.
What did you determine the cause of death to be?
Judge found objection foundation.
Sustained.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yes.
He performed the autopsy. So I think he's already testified that he performed the autopsy. So I'm asking what his results of that autopsy were.
And Judge, if I could respond.
Well, on second thought, I will overrule the objection. I'll allow him to make the response, and clearly it's grounds that may be gone into on cross, Mr. Pryor, but you can go ahead, Ms. Blake.
What did you determine the cause of death to be?
We ruled her cause of death to be asphyxia.
What did you determine her manner of death to be?
We determined her manner of death to be homicide.
And when you use the term homicide, can you talk about what that means in relation to your office?
Sure. It is different from, for example, how lawyers or police might use that term. For us, homicide is a vital records determination that we make. In this case, we didn't sign the death certificate, but that's the way we use the term. It's a determination of the circumstances surrounding the death, and it means to us that another person was involved in that person's death. It does not imply intent, although it does not exclude it either.
And when we talk about asphyxia, can you tell the jury what you mean by the term asphyxia?
Asphyxia means that the person was unable to get enough oxygen.
Can there be a number of causes or different means by which asphyxia can occur?
Yes.
Can you talk about some of those?
Sure. You can have asphyxia can result from anything that occludes the airway, either externally or internally. So smothering of any type, anything that blocks the mouth and nose could lead to asphyxia. Choking, anything that blocks the airway internally, whether it's food or something stuffed in someone's mouth or whatever, maybe all of those things can lead to asphyxia. Asphyxia can also result from drowning. Drowning is technically a form of asphyxia. You can also have asphyxial deaths that result from chemical asphyxiants. Carbon monoxide is one of those. Cyanide is another that impair your body's ability to release oxygen to tissues, and so they don't get enough oxygen.
And you talked a little bit about the process of an autopsy already. Any other obvious injuries that would have been the cause of her death?
The only that would be the cause of her death, no.
Can you walk us through how you ended up reaching your conclusion that this was the cause of death was asphyxiation?
Sure. So as I was just asked, we didn't find any traumatic injury that would explain her death. We also didn't find any natural disease that would explain her death. Her heart was completely normal. Her lungs were normal, except for some fluid buildup in them. Her liver, kidneys, all of her organs were normal. And so we did not identify an anatomic or pathologic explanation for her death. She did have the only real finding she had, apart from, no lethal trauma and no significant natural disease, was some bruising on her arms and one bruise on her chest. Um, and then when we get to that point, essentially no findings that will explain the death directly, then there are a limited number of things that can explain a death in that context. One is asphyxia. Obviously, that's what we ruled it to be. And that can be, any number of things that, as I discussed, that can lead to asphyxia. But in this case, we believe primarily was related to some form of suffocation. But other things that can lead to death in that context that leave no findings for us to see would be things like seizures. There are inherited and even acquired forms of heart rhythm disturbances that can lead to a sudden death with nothing for us to see at autopsy. And then obviously drug intoxications don't leave anything for us to see. She did have, as I said, some fluid in her lungs. That's a very common finding in the setting of drug deaths. And one of the reasons that we spent a lot of time trying to evaluate for intoxicants that might possibly have led to her death.
And if we break that down a little bit, and I don't know if you use this term, but negative autopsy. Can you explain what a negative autopsy is?
Yeah, essentially what I was just getting at, where we don't have findings, we don't have pathology, we don't have trauma that explains death. We have essentially normal, a person with normal anatomy who has died.
And so in this case, when we talk about it being a negative autopsy, is that because there was not a clear way to determine the cause of death right away?
Yes.
And you talked about one of the other potentials when you're dealing with a negative autopsy as being seizures. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about what a seizure is?
Sure. A seizure is a manifestation externally in some fashion of abnormal electrical discharges in the brain. That can be what you typically think of as a seizure, where someone goes stiff and collapses and then convulses. People can also have what are called partial seizures, where they may have, movement of one part of their body, or they may have staring spells or other things of that nature as a result of seizure activity. But it's abnormal electrical changes in the brain that result in abnormal behavior, usually associated with loss of consciousness, and also not under the person's control. They just happen.
Have you conducted autopsies before where there were signs that a seizure had occurred or there had been seizure activity?
Yes.
And where would those signs usually show up?
So there's a number of ways. Sometimes those signs show up in the body. Sometimes they show up in the medical records. There's a variety of ways that we have to, evaluate the role of seizures in a death. From a historical standpoint, if somebody has a history of epilepsy, then obviously that can contribute. But looking at the person's body, the main things that we might see would be things that you would expect: trauma to the person's tongue, for example, and that can be recent or old. And then evidence of incontinence of either bowel or bladder. Those would be the primary two main physical findings that we might see, but certainly people with seizures are known to die suddenly and unexpectedly in the absence of having had a recent seizure. Having seizures, having a diagnosis of epilepsy puts you at risk for sudden death. And so it's not, certainly we don't have to have those things if someone has a well-established history to attribute their death to a seizure disorder or epilepsy. But in the absence of significant history and the absence of anatomic findings, we don't generally are not going to call a death as seizure related. And it's also not uncommon for people to have seizures as a terminal event. If, for example, you have a heart attack and your heart's not beating normally, and your brain's not getting enough oxygen, you may seize. Or if you're diabetic and hypoglycemic, you may seize, but that's not because you have seizures. It's because of some other condition contributing to that.
During Tammy's autopsy, did you find any physical signs of seizure activity?
We did not.
And you reviewed Tammy's medical records, is that correct?
Yes,
Any signs of seizure activity in her medical records?
there's no mention.
In your experience, would it be uncommon for someone Tammy's age to have all of a sudden developed seizures?
It would be very unlikely.
And do you know how old she was?
49 at the time of her death.
Do you recall reviewing some information provided by Chad Daybell to the coroner or a deputy about Tammy having seizures?
I reviewed some records from the coroner, yes, that mentioned that he had said she had had some shaking spells or fits or something. I don't recall the exact verbiage, but something that suggested that, yes.
Did you find anything to support that Tammy had had seizures in your review of her medical records and or the autopsy?
No.
And I think you mentioned, I may say this wrong, but arrhythmia.
Yes. Mhm.
Can you explain a little bit about what arrhythmia would be or arrhythmia irregularities?
Sure. Your heart, in addition to being a pump, is also a very electrically dependent organ. Your heart's normal pumping function is dependent on electrical impulses traveling in a normal way through the heart. And those electrical impulses happen the way they do because there are what are called ion channels that open and close and allow electrolytes to move through the heart and propagate those impulses. There are both inherited disorders of those channels as well as acquired things. Those channels can be impacted by certain medications and other things that put people at risk of sudden death by prolonging their what's called their QT interval. And so they having either of those, either something acquired because of medication or something that has been inherited, would put a person at risk of sudden death.
And when you looked at Tammy's heart, did you see anything that showed irregularities?
No, in those settings, most of the time the heart is going to look normal. And so we don't, we would, in any of those settings, we would not expect to see anything abnormal with the heart grossly. Just to look at it, it would look normal. But we also would not expect to see, again, that type of condition manifest itself at her age without some other, if she had, certainly she could have it as an acquired condition at her age. If she had, for example, methadone is very commonly known to do that, but she didn't have any methadone in her system. There are a long list of other medications that can do that. Fluoxetine, which she was on, is also rarely been described as doing that, but she had been on a very stable dose for a very long time and with no indication that that had been a problem for her.
So similar to this sudden onset of seizures, you wouldn't expect to see the cardiac arrhythmia come into play with someone at 49 years old?
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. That's a bit leading.
Sustained.
Would you expect to see the cardiac arrhythmia come into play suddenly in someone 49 years old?
Judge, objection. Leading.
Overruled.
No.
And I believe one of the other things you talked about that could result in a negative autopsy would be some kind of an intoxicant.
Yes.
Are there sometimes signs during the autopsy that you're able to find showing that a death was caused by intoxicants?
There are things that suggest that. There are very few things that will allow that to be diagnosed at the time of autopsy. Most intoxication-related deaths at the time of the autopsy are initially certified as pending further investigation or pending toxicology results. Because there's just not anything that we see. One of the findings that is, though, very suggestive that we see not infrequently is what's called pulmonary edema, which is fluid buildup in the lungs. And it's a nonspecific thing that can result from lots of causes. We see it in drowning cases. We see it in people with heart failure. But we certainly very commonly in our patient population see it in people that overdose, especially on opiates.
When we talk about intoxicants, does that also include poisons?
Yes.
You talked about a lot of times it will be pending some additional testing if an intoxicant is suspected. Did you do some additional testing in this case?
Yes, we did.
And can you talk a little bit about let me back up. Where exactly do you obtain samples on someone that's been embalmed to have that testing done?
Yeah. So as a rule, because someone is embalmed, part of that embalming process involves removing or at least diluting their blood with embalming fluid. So we generally don't have great blood samples to use. We will collect fluid from the vessels that generally would be a mixture of blood and embalming fluid to test if we wish. But we do our primary testing usually on a tissue sample in an embalmed person, usually liver, because liver provides the best postmortem reference samples for the most number of substances.
And were those samples obtained in Tammy's case?
Yes.
What is then done with those samples?
So we then send them to the lab for analysis. We request testing for a wide variety of analytes. In this case, we tested for hundreds of different prescription, illicit, and over-the-counter medications, as well as a large number of what are called novel psychoactive substances, which are some are illicit, some are not, but they're newer drugs that are being used illicitly. We also did testing for heavy metals, did some testing for pesticides, did testing for some additional biologic toxins, plant-based toxins, and I think those are the primary things. But looked for all of those things in her samples.
Was there anything in the results that would explain her death?
No.
Was more than one agency involved in the testing?
Yes. So we had the majority of the testing was performed by National Medical Services Laboratory in Pennsylvania, which is a sort of the premier forensic toxicology lab in the country. We use them as a reference lab. They test about a third of our cases at the Utah Medical Examiner's Office. And then we also had some testing. They don't, for example, do testing for any of the plant-based toxins. They don't test for nerve agents and those kind of things. And we had those looked for specifically by the state's chemical and biological threat lab.
Would it be fair to say that this was pretty extensive toxicology testing?
Yes.
Was the reason for all the testing because it was a negative autopsy?
Yes. And driven certainly by that, as well as the circumstances surrounding her death.
And in your opinion, did the fact that Tammy was already embalmed inhibit the ability to test for those substances?
For the most part, it did not inhibit the ability to test. Some of the results we had to look at a different analyte because of potentially interfering substances from the embalming fluid. But for the most part, it did not interfere with that at all. And generally, it doesn't.
Was there anything at all from the toxicology testing that stood out to you?
I mean, the only significant positive result was the presence of her fluoxetine, which she had been prescribed for a number of years, and it was present at a non-toxic level. Um, Beyond that, there were some, a minimal elevation of selenium, which is a heavy metal, also at a non-toxic level, um, but really nothing else that was significant.
And you had talked about sending out for that toxicology testing in part because of the circumstances surrounding her death, correct?
Yes.
Do you recall some of the circumstances that stood out to you?
I mean, specifically, we would probably do more extensive testing in any case where an exhumation is ordered because of potential uh, criminal activity. So that would be the primary circumstance, if you will, that would drive that for us. Not really any necessarily specifics in this case, but because with an exhumation, you again, like most autopsies, you really only have one chance at getting what you want and being able to test what you need to. The having that be the reason that this person is coming to you is primarily the reason we would drive that, and in conjunction with, then we get to the end of the autopsy and don't have any specific cause of death identified.
And Your Honor, I'm going to ask if I can have States Exhibit 295. I think there were several subparts with it.
Very well.
And Your Honor, I'm going to ask for permission to publish 295E.
All right. Can I have a brief sidebar with council?
Yes.
So people want to go on this, right?
All right, so there's some photographs that are going to be offered, and I'm not going to permit them to be published to the public in general. They'll be published to the jurors as well as the parties because they're graphic in nature. However, it appears we've got this issue again with the jurors' monitors, and if those are not currently working, that's where you're headed next to publish. Is that correct, Ms. Blake?
That is correct, Your Honor.
Okay, well, we're going to do our best to sort out this monitor issue so the jurors can see these photographs upon their admission, but I think we may have to have tech run up here to sort that issue out again. So we are going to take a morning break at this point and get that resolved as quickly as we can. We'll come back on with additional evidence once those monitors are working. So appreciate your patience, ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
All right, please. All right.
All right, thank you. Please be seated. All right, we'll have the jurors return, please.
Yes, Your Honor.
Oh, thank you. I've got some, but thank you.
All right, please. For your help, as accounted for, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bailiff. Please be seated. All right, we're back from the mid-morning recess. I believe we've got the issue sorted with the jurors' monitors. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, in attendance here for moving over to the other side of the courtroom so that those monitors aren't visible. Ms. Blake, if you'd like to continue with your direct, you may do so.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I had asked to publish, I believe states 295D. I'm going to change that to publish 295J. It's a previously admitted exhibit.
Okay, 295J, previously admitted, may be published.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Christensen, as part of your review of documents provided in this case, do you recall reviewing photos that were taken at the scene of Tammy's death?
I do.
And Judge, I am flying blind here if this is being shown or not.
It is.
Thank you. Dr. Christensen, on that photo, can you see something coming out of Tammy's mouth?
Yes.
Can you describe what we're seeing there?
Yes. This is foam, essentially. It's what a manifestation of pulmonary edema. You can see running down the left side of her face what looks like blood. Pulmonary edema fluid, as it comes up, is edema fluid is just fluid that leaks into the air spaces when it normally should be contained in blood vessels. And as it leaks into the air spaces, normally there is protein and other things within those air spaces to help keep them open. And as the fluid gets in there, it mixes with that protein and creates this bubbly, frothy fluid, which can then bubble up through the airway and out the nose or the mouth, or both.
Can there be several causes of pulmonary edema, or what ultimately causes that, or is it a result from?
Yes, pulmonary edema, again, I think I said previously, is a nonspecific finding that can result from any kind of insult to the lungs. We certainly see it in asphyxial cases. We see it in drowning cases. We see it in the setting of heart failure. We see it in the setting of drug intoxications. Those are probably the primary places where we see it, although really anything that causes respiratory failure can ultimately cause pulmonary edema to manifest in this way, pneumonias and other things.
Did the presence of the pulmonary edema also play into your findings in this matter?
Yes,
And we've talked about Utah being a medical examiner system. So you yourself or another medical or forensic pathologist will respond out to a death scene in Utah, generally speaking.
in cases where the pathologist will respond to scenes where there is a homicide or suspected homicide, or in any case where we're requested to by law enforcement at the scene or our other investigators at the scene.
Do you know in Utah if someone responds out on unattended deaths?
Yes,
And is that generally someone from your office, whether an investigator or otherwise?
yes, it's one of our investigators in most cases.
If you had seen the pulmonary edema, is this a case in which you would have had an autopsy performed?
Given the amount of information that was provided at the scene, what was relayed to me as what was shared at the scene, there's not an adequate explanation or sufficient medical history to explain her death at her age in a sudden and unexpected way without doing an autopsy examination.
I think we've gone over this a little bit, but when you did the internal part of the autopsy, did you notice, was there anything out of the ordinary in relation to Tammy's organs?
No,
Was there anything,
except for her lungs. Sorry.
and can you explain what was out of the ordinary with her lungs?
Her lungs were a little bit on the heavy side, heavier than would normally be expected, and had fluid in them. There were also changes related to her prior embalming.
Had you conducted other autopsies where pulmonary edema was present?
Yes,
Is pulmonary edema by itself actually a cause of death?
it's not.
Would it be the result of the cause of death?
Yes, it certainly could be. So if someone has pulmonary edema because they drown, drowning would be that. If they have pulmonary edema because they have heart failure, because they've had multiple heart attacks, then the underlying cause of their heart attacks would be their cause of death. But all of those kinds of things, anything, lots of different things can result in pulmonary edema.
And is pulmonary edema generally a manifestation or finding associated with asphyxiation being the cause of death?
It certainly can be, yes.
And we've talked a little bit as well about your review of the external part of Tammy's body. Do you recall that?
Yes,
And you'd referenced the only external injuries you had seen were some bruises.
that's correct.
And Your Honor, I have what's been marked as State's Exhibit 179. If I can have counsel handed a copy, and I have a courtesy copy for Your Honor, and then I would ask that the witness be handed a copy.
Very well.
And Your Honor, this exhibit is some blank diagrams. My intent is to have it handed to the witness and have him add some markings to it.
Very well.
May I have the witness handed a pen?
Thank you.
The exhibit's not yet admitted, Ms. Blake. And I understand, because if it's going to be altered, just think of when that would take place if you're offering it.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Christensen, would you mark on that diagram where the bruising was located on Tammy Daybell's body?
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. And have you marked those based on your recollection of where you observed those injuries during the autopsy?
Yes.
And Your Honor, I would move for the admission of State's Exhibit 179.
All right, the exhibit now with the markings, I think it would be appropriate for defense counsel to see what the exhibit now looks like before I ask if there's any objection. All right, Mr. Bailiff, if you'd please submit that exhibit for reference to Mr. Pryor.
Your Honor, now that counsel's been shown a copy, I would move for the admission of State's Exhibit 179.
Okay, and I apologize, I lost track. Where is the exhibit at this point? Did you retrieve it?
I have it. Would Your Honor like to see it first?
No, that's fine. I'll ask at this point. Thank you, Ms. Blake. Is there any objection to exhibit 179 being?
If it's
admitted?
being offered for demonstrative purposes, Judge, I don't have an objection.
Okay, exhibit 179 will be admitted as a demonstrative exhibit. Ms. Blake, you may inquire.
And Your Honor, I would ask permission to publish.
You may publish.
And Dr. Christensen, you can see on this exhibit, there's an R and an L that's been written in. Would you indicate what those represent?
Yes, those simply represent the right and left sides of the body. And at the bottom, I also indicated which was the front and which was the back, although that's fairly obvious.
And then it appears that there have been several dots or markings added. Could you explain what those represent?
Yes, they are not to scale, but they are representations of the locations where we identified bruises.
And on the front, there appear to be 6 dots. Is that correct?
Yes,
And then on the back of the body, 4 dots.
that's correct.
And you've already indicated they're not to scale, but can you talk about and put into the record where on the body these bruises were located?
Yes. There's one on the left upper chest, 3 over the anterior and lateral right biceps, 1 on the anterior right forearm, one over the anterior portion of the left biceps, 2 over the right triceps area on the back of the upper arm, and 2 on the back of the right forearm.
Did you discover any bruising on the lower extremities?
We did not.
Did you discover any bruising around the head or face area?
We did not.
And did you in fact take photos of the bruises that were observed during the autopsy?
Yes.
You talked before about the difficulty in determining the age of a bruise by simply looking at it. Is there something else that you did in this case to try to determine how recent the bruises occurred?
Yes. As I mentioned, just the visual appearance doesn't necessarily indicate to us how old a bruise is, but we can at least attempt to narrow that down somewhat by looking at the tissue in the bruise under the microscope. Blunt injuries of the body undergo a relatively orderly progression, although certainly not very time specific in a, to the minute or even to the hour sort of way. But initially, when there is an injury, you see just hemorrhage in the tissue. Then that will be followed some hours later, can be as early as 2, might be as many as 12 or even 24 hours. You will then see inflammation start to enter the area to clean up the hemorrhage. And depending on the severity of it, you may then also see what are called macrophages that come in and start to clean up some of the broken down blood cells. You may see the formation of scar tissue if it's significant, and that goes through a progression from early what are called fibroblastic cells in the area, which are just the cells that make scar tissue, which then eventually become replaced by the scar tissue itself. And that allows us, seeing what kind of changes are present in an injury can give us an indication whether this is recent, meaning minutes to hours old, whether it's hours to days old, or whether it's days to weeks or even longer old. But more specific than those sort of broad swaths of time, we can't narrow it down.
We talked about during the autopsy, photos were taken to document the injuries.
Yes.
Were photos also taken of examination done of the injuries?
Yes.
And Your Honor, I have what's been marked as States Exhibit 178 A to Q. Counsel was provided a copy today.
The series of photographs, is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor. It's a series of photographs taken during the autopsy. And I believe the witness has been handled that jump drive. I would move for the admission of States Exhibit 178 A to Q.
And there would be no objection by the defense to that exhibit, Judge.
Okay, so exhibit 178 A through Q, it's 178 is the exhibit, A through Q are individual photographs within the exhibit, and they're all admitted, Ms. Blake.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would ask to be handed that jump drive back. Your Honor, I will indicate these are graphic photos. I am going to be asking to publish them to the jury.
Very well. We'll have those published, and as I mentioned, we've had the monitors arranged so the public's not viewing those and they're not being streamed on the live stream.
Dr. Christensen, do you see that image on your monitor?
I do.
Can you tell us what we're observing here?
This is the bruise that's on her left chest.
And in this image?
This is a closer up image of the same injury.
And can you talk about, there's a little scale there. What is the purpose of putting that on the photo?
Just so we have a reference to the size of it when you get zoomed in, especially in a picture like this, it's sometimes you can't always tell exactly where you are or have a reference point to know what size something is. So we include a scale so we have a reference.
And in this photo, can you talk about what we're seeing?
This is an incision through that area of bruising.
And can you talk about why you did that in this particular case?
And with all of these, looking at the tissue, like I said, microscopically will give us some idea what they look like. So this is a prelude to having a sample to look at under the microscope. But it also confirms there are things, for example, certain dermatologic conditions and other things that can look like a bruise on the surface, but when you incise them, there's no evidence of hemorrhage in the tissue. So in this case, we can see that there is hemorrhage in the tissue.
And in this particular photo?
This is again a photo of the same area with the a tissue section removed that demonstrates the hemorrhage placed into what we call a cassette. That little white plastic thing is that that tissue that is placed in there is then taken and processed and turned into a microscopic slide that I can review under the microscope.
Ms. Blake, on these, would you care to identify each by the sub-exhibit letter, if you don't mind?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
And the first one that was referenced of the chest is going to be 178A. The close-up of the chest is 178B. The first incision is 178C. And the most recent one that was referenced would be 178D with the slide showing an excision of the chest.
Thank you, Ms. Blake.
When you looked at this, what, if anything, did the, I think you used the term hemorrhage, what, if anything, did that tell you in relation to this bruise?
That it is a bruise. Just looking at it grossly doesn't necessarily tell us much, except that there is hemorrhage there. And then seeing it under the microscope gives us further information about that.
And then moving to 178E, can
So-
you? Oh. Yeah, 178E, can you tell us what we're seeing in this photo?
Yes, this is an excision of tissue of the bruise of the left biceps.
And again, in those excisions, were you able to determine anything in relation to whether that was a bruise?
It was. Yes, there's hemorrhage within the subcutaneous fat. Normally, an excision of skin will just show a layer of normal pinkish tan skin on top, and all of the fat beneath it will be a bright yellow color, like is evident in most of those sections, but there are also darker areas indicative of hemorrhage.
And then on this slide, what are we seeing here?
This is a closer up image of the same injury and same excision.
And Your Honor, this is, we moved on to 178F.
All right.
This is 178G. Can you tell us what we're seeing in this image?
This is a photograph of the two bruises on the back of the right upper arm.
And moving to 178H, can you tell us what we're seeing in this image?
Yes, this image depicts the three bruises on the right biceps as well as two on the right forearm.
And there are some other markings there, it looks like, on the forearm in addition to those blue marks. Do you know what those marks were?
Yes, those are areas where mold had grown and we'd subsequently cleaned that off.
So those are not bruises.
They are not.
And then moving to 178J, can you tell us what we're seeing in this image?
This is a closer up image of the right biceps demonstrating the bruising there.
And 178K, can you tell us what we're seeing here?
Again, this is an excision of the tissue of the lower of the three injuries to the right biceps with the excised tissue in the cassette.
And what did that tell you when you did, when you took that excision?
just shows us more hemorrhage in the tissues.
And did that indicate to you that those were in fact bruises?
Yes.
And 178L, can you tell us what we're seeing here?
I believe, actually, I'm not positive looking at it, whether that's the same as the last image.
And if I back up to the last image,
Yes.
if that has the letter B at the end on that white slide, does that help in reference?
Yes, this
And-
is just a close-up image of 178J, I believe, the immediately prior image.
And when we look at this one, it appears that there's more of that dark coloration. Can you explain what that would indicate?
It's just that there's hemorrhage in a larger area of tissue.
Would that be indicative of a larger bruise or a deeper bruise, or could you tell?
I mean, it's clearly both deeper and larger in terms of the area that's damaged.
And moving on to 178M. Oops. Get back to the right image here. Looking at 178M, what are we seeing here?
It's labeled L on my screen. I believe. It's the right forearm with 2 bruises.
And going to the next one here, what are we seeing in this image?
This one is labeled M and is a closer up image of those 2 areas of bruising.
And those are again on the right forearm.
Yes.
And then moving to 178N, can you tell us what we're seeing here?
This is an excision through one of those 2 bruises on the right forearm.
And what, if anything, did this excision tell you?
Again, confirms that it's a bruise, that there is hemorrhage in the skin and soft tissue.
And then moving to 178P.
This is an image of a bruise on the anterior forearm, right forearm.
And then moving to 178Q.
Again, a closer up image of that same bruise on the anterior right forearm.
And 178. Oh, this is marked as 178. Oh, can you tell what we're looking at here?
Yes, this is the right forearm with an excision through that area of bruising.
And that was on the front of the forearm.
Yes.
And Dr. Christensen, were you able to make any kind of a determination as to when in time those bruises may have occurred?
They all showed evidence of hemorrhage in the tissue with no evidence of any sort of inflammatory response or cleanup response. So they would have occurred sometime from minutes to hours prior to her death.
And I think you indicated, but these would have occurred prior to her death. Is that correct?
Most likely. You certainly can bruise a deceased body, but generally speaking, that's not going to occur for a very protracted period of time once circulation stops. Mostly the types of blunt injuries that we see in people that have already passed are more things like lacerations, where a body might be dropped or something of that nature, but it certainly could have happened right around the time of death.
And when you look at the location of those bruises in your training and experience, could they be consistent with someone being restrained?
They could be.
When you looked at Tammy's body, did you notice any signs of lividity?
Yes.
Could you explain to the jury a little bit about what lividity is?
Sure. There are a number of postmortem changes that a body undergoes after death. And lividity is one of them. It's also called livor mortis. It is pooling of the blood, which normally has been circulating through the body under pressure. Once that stops, gravity then takes over and kind of pools the blood in whatever is the most dependent portion of the body, the part closest to the ground. If a person is laying on their back, the areas where it is supported by, whatever, a bed, the floor, a chair, whatever it might be, will not demonstrate lividity, but areas around that will fill with blood, and it makes initially a sort of a reddish purple color that is where the blood is just pooling. It can change over time for a few hours. It's one of the ways we have to look at whether a body has been moved after death, for example. But if once it's there and well established, usually by 12 hours or so, it won't change anymore, and it will stay in the position it was in, or that person was in, if they stayed in it for 12 hours. If they're moved prior to that time, then it can also move to where a new position. If someone dies, for example, on their back, stays there for a couple of hours, and then is rolled to their front, that blood that had started to pool on their back will then start to pool to their front. And over a period of, the next 10, 12 hours or so, depending on how long a person stays in their initial position, if you move them after 2 hours, more of that blood will redistribute than if you move them after 6 hours, than if you move them after 10 hours. And at some point, and at 12 hours is not a hard and fast thing, but at some point that lividity becomes fixed and will not change no matter what position they get moved to.
Where did you observe the lividity on Tammy's body?
It was all on her back, and because she'd been embalmed, it had changed somewhat in color. It was a little bit more gray in color, but the distribution was still very typical.
Just to clarify, does lividity allow you to determine a time of death?
It does not. No.
Can you talk a little bit about what rigor mortis is?
Sure. Rigor mortis is one of the other sort of three postmortem changes in the body. Lividity is one, rigor mortis is one, and then cooling of the body is the third. But rigor mortis is a stiffening of the body that happens after death. Initially, when a person dies, they will be flaccid or just completely floppy and not show any muscular resistance. Within an hour or two, they start to become stiff. Initially, we see that in the smaller muscle groups, in the hands and the face and other places, but it will progress to involve all the muscles of the body, and will become, essentially very solid and very difficult to move after a period of hours. And then once it's fully developed, which is somewhere, around 12 hours also, it will stay that way until the body starts to decompose. And then that, can vary dramatically depending on where the person is. If they're in a cool environment, if they're in a hot environment, if they're next to a heater, all of those kind of things can change how fast decomposition ensues. But once a person becomes fully stiff from rigor mortis, they'll stay that way until they start to decompose.
Can you determine a time of death based on rigor mortis?
So we are asked pretty much usually only in the context of court testimony to discuss times of death or how long a person might have been dead.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. This is becoming narrative, and I've tried to be patient, but the question called for a yes or no, and we got this narrative. So I am going to object.
Dr. Christensen, can you explain how rigor mortis would play in or not play into determining a time of death?
It can help us, depending on the degree that it is present or not present, to look at, how long a person has been dead, but it's highly variable and imprecise.
And as a forensic pathologist, do you generally determine a specific time of death?
No.
Does the presence of rigor mortis allow you to narrow a time window of when someone may have passed away?
To some extent, yes.
In this case, did you learn what time Tammy's death was reported?
Excuse me, yes. My recollection that it was sometime just prior to 6 in the morning.
Had you learned or heard the description with regard to the condition of Tammy's body?
My recollection is that she was described as being cold and stiff or cool and stiff. I don't remember which, but at the time she was found.
Based on that description, would it indicate to you that rigor mortis had set in?
Yes,
You were not present on the day of Tammy's death, is that correct?
I was not.
You did not, is it fair to say you did not get the benefit of viewing her body just after the death was reported?
That's fair. Yes.
So as a medical examiner and or a forensic pathologist, do you rely on external information that's provided?
Yes.
Does that external information assist in your forming an expert opinion regarding a reference to when the person may have died?
Yes.
And in this case, did you in fact gain that external information?
Yes. Mhm.
And were you able to come up with any kind of an estimate regarding a time of death in relation to Tammy?
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. It calls for speculation. His previous testimony confirms that. It would just be purely speculative for him to.
And
make
Your
a
Honor, if I
guess.
may respond.
Respond, please.
He's an expert providing an expert opinion. He's already said he reviewed documents, he gathered information, he made a determination that rigor mortis would have set in given the description and information provided to him. So he's basing it off the information and forming an expert opinion.
And in response, Judge, he wasn't present at the time. He didn't observe those factors himself. He's relying on what the police have told him. And at this point, he can't make that estimation.
All right, I've considered the objection. I'm going to overrule the objection, finding it's proper in the form of an expert testimony. It will be subject to cross, so you can proceed with the question again, Ms. Blake.
Thank you. Based on the information provided to you and your experience, did you form any opinion in relation to a time of death or a time window in relation to Tammy's death?
Yes.
And what did you determine?
That she had likely been dead for at least an hour or two for her body to be described as stiff, but certainly could be much more than that, many hours. But it's unlikely to have been more recent than an hour.
And you did review medical records in relation to this case, is that correct?
I did, yes.
Would someone having anemia or a past history explain a sudden death?
It would depend on the degree and the severity of anemia, but if it's not a current problem, no.
Would someone using essential oils or treating themselves with items bought at a health food store generally explain a sudden death?
No.
And we talked about those bruises and saw images of them. Did those bruises and their location play into your findings in this case?
Yes.
And again, in a negative autopsy, you looked at the other potential reasons or causes of death that could result in a negative autopsy. Is that correct?
Yes.
Based on your experience in training, did you find it to be likely that Tammy Daybell died of a seizure?
No.
Based on your training and experience, did you find it likely that Tammy Daybell died of a cardiorrhythmia?
No.
Based on your training and experience and lab results, did you find it likely that Tammy died of an intoxicant?
No.
And when we're talking about the negative autopsy, what did that leave as the cause of death?
Asphyxia.
Your Honor, if I may have just a moment.
Yes.
I have no further questions.
All right, thank you. All right, Mr. Pryor, you can cross. You turn on the microphone, please.
Let's do that again. Judge, by stipulation of the parties, I'll move for admission of Exhibit 102 and 103. That's Defense Exhibit 102 and 103 that represents the autopsy. And then the first one's the 26-page autopsy. 103 would contemplate the additional pictures and some analysis as well by this witness.
All right, the defense has moved for admission of Exhibit 102. Does the state have any objection to that being admitted?
Your Honor, it's my understanding that that is the autopsy report created by the Office of the Utah Medical Examiner. And if that's what it is, in addition to some lab results and other findings, the state has no objection.
Okay, so as I understand, there'd be no objection on 102 and 103. If and when those become published, if they are, Ms. Blake, if they're not what you anticipated, let me know and we'll quickly review that to make sure they are the exhibits you believe have been admitted. So those are admitted, Mr. Pryor.
Okay. And Doctor, you mentioned that you're retired as the chief, was it the chief medical examiner out of Utah?
Yes.
And that's out of Salt Lake City, is that right?
Taylorsville, but Salt Lake County, yes.
And I'm not familiar with Utah, so is that close to Salt Lake City?
Yes, yes.
Okay. The government hub of the state of Utah, is that right? Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about the initial cause of death reported for Tammy Daybell, and it did say pulmonary edema. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you were able to confirm that through this autopsy as well, correct?
I was able to confirm through the autopsy that pulmonary edema was present, but
Right.
not that it was the cause of death.
Okay. Now, when we talk about pulmonary edema in this particular case, can you tell me how long would it have taken to produce the kind of pulmonary edema that you found during the autopsy?
I don't know.
There's no way to determine that.
No.
And there's also no way to determine whether it had advanced or whether it had declined. You exhumed Tammy Daybell's body and you have to report the facts as you see the facts at the time upon the exhumation, right?
That's correct.
And at this point, you had initially indicated that you went in front of you didn't, but you were present when a hearing was held in front of a judge to make a determination as to whether or not they would have exhumed Tammy Daybell. Is that right?
That's correct.
And do you recall from your knowledge what was the reason for the exhuming the body at that time?
My recollection is it was to determine the cause of death.
Well, there had to have been some facts. You don't get to just dig somebody up.
Your Honor, counsel's testifying, move to strike.
Sustain.
There has to be a reason at the hearing to determine why you're exhuming.
Your Honor, counsel's still testifying.
Sustain.
Isn't it true, doctor, that there has to be a reason for the exhumation and not just be to re-examine findings? Is that correct?
I would assume so, yes.
Well, you were present. What was the reason given for digging Tammy Daybell's body back up?
I don't recall specifically what was presented.
Okay, so what was the purpose of you going there if you don't remember why they dug her up?
Objection, Your Honor, argumentative.
Sustained.
Do you recall whether or not there were discussions about surrounding circumstances that could have influenced a decision to exhume?
I believe there were, yes.
Okay, and those circumstances that they justified for exhuming were the death of Charles Vallow, right?
Objection, Your Honor, counsel's testifying. The witness has said he doesn't recall.
The fact is those additional circumstances that you based the reason to dig Tammy Daybell up out of the ground was because of the death of Charles Vallow.
Objection, Your Honor, counsel's misstating this witness was not the one that requested the exhumation.
Sustained.
Do you recall whether or not there was a discussion about the death of Charles Vallow at the exhumation hearing?
I do not.
Do you recall whether there was discussion of Brandon Boudreaux as a basis for the exhumation of Tammy Daybell's body?
I also do not know.
Okay, so you don't remember any reason, is that right, for why they decided to dig a body up out of the ground? Is that-
Objection, Your Honor, argumentative, and it's asked and answered.
Sustained.
You don't have any explanation that you recall as to why they dug Tammy Daybell's body up out of the ground, do you?
Objection, Your Honor, argumentative, and asked and answered.
Overruled on that.
You don't have any,
Prior, he gets to answer though.
I think I said previously, my understanding was to determine the cause of death.
but you don't specifically remember the factors as to why they dug her up, right? That were offered to a judge?
I don't remember the specifics of the discussion.
Okay. And you don't, now, you talked a little bit about Utah, and from what I understand, you can do it by request of the family, is that right? Or you can do it by request of going in front of a judge and giving justifiable reasons as to why you would dig a body up out of the ground, right?
I believe that is the way the statute reads.
Right. And in this particular case, the family was never notified, right?
Objection, Your Honor, calls for speculation and irrelevant.
Overruled if the witness has information he can answer. And I want to hear the answer.
To my knowledge, the family was not notified.
So in other words, then the other side of the statute is that you went in front of a judge, not you, but someone went in front of a judge and got an order to exhume her body. Is that right?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, even though you were present, you don't remember the facts that were presented as.
Objection, Your Honor, asked and answered.
Sustained.
Now, you made a comment, in your autopsy that you performed. And you noted that the bruises were what are called very non-specific bruises. You remember that?
I don't recall the specifics of how I described them in the report. I'd be happy to look at it and refresh my memory, but I don't. So bruises by nature are non-specific.
Okay. And do you recall testifying last April and May in another proceeding in which you, in response to a question, described the bruises as non-specific, correct?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay. And when we're talking about non-specific bruises, what that means isn't it true? What that means is that you can't identify the cause of those bruises. Is that correct?
A specific cause, no.
Right. In fact, you can't tell how those bruises ended up on someone's body, correct?
That's correct.
All you can tell is that the nature of those bruises and whether they're bruises, right?
And I can offer opinions about how they might have been inflicted, but
Oh.
there's a wide variety of those.
But in this particular case, you said they're non-specific, correct?
Even non-specific bruising can have multiple potential modes of infliction, yes.
Okay. And in this case, you identified the bruises as non-specific. We've established that,
Yes.
correct?
Mhm.
And you can't tell me how those bruises were placed on the body of Tammy Daybell, correct?
I cannot.
Or how she got those bruises.
I cannot.
And the reality is we can go back as far as 24 hours and those bruises could have been 24 hours old. Isn't that true?
Potentially, yes.
Or 12 hours true, right?
Yes.
And we can't even put a legitimate time as to when those bruises actually got, or she incurred those bruises on her body, correct?
Beyond the timeframes we've spoken of, no.
Right. And in addition, you didn't speak to any of the family members, the immediately family members about these bruises on Tammy Daybell, did you?
I did not.
You didn't talk to the family about any medical history that Tammy may have had about treating herself for bruises, did you?
I did not.
You didn't look at any of the reports or any of the medicine from the time of her arrest in which there was a notation about bruising cream that Tammy